Over the skies of France in July 1942, a German ace with 27 confirmed kills closed on what he thought was another easy victory. His Focke-Wulf FW-190, the Luftwaffe's newest and most dominant fighter, had been massacring Spitfire Mk IVs for months. Every German pilot knew the FW-190 was superior in almost every performance category: faster, better climbing, more heavily armed. This particular ace had personally shot down 6 Spitfires in the previous month, and the aircraft in his gun sight looked like just another Mk V. He positioned himself for the kill, confident in his advantages. Then the Spitfire turned. Not the sluggish, desperate turn of a Mk V trying to avoid the inevitable, but a tight, controlled turn that kept the German ace from getting into firing position. The Spitfire accelerated, pulling away from the FW-190 with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. It climbed, outclimbing the German fighter that was supposed to dominate at altitude. For 5 minutes, the German ace tried everything in his tactical repertoire, but the Spitfire matched or exceeded his every move. Finally, the roles reversed, and the German found himself desperately evading as the Spitfire got onto his tail. He barely escaped, diving away and fleeing at full throttle. When he returned to base, shaken and confused, his squadron mates initially didn't believe his report. A Spitfire that could outperform an FW-190? It seemed impossible. But within weeks, similar reports flooded in from German units across the Channel front. Something had changed. The aircraft that looked like a Spitfire Mk V was actually something entirely different, the Spitfire Mk IX, and it was about to end German air superiority and shock the Luftwaffe's best pilots into realizing they no longer had the advantage they'd taken for granted. Welcome to Cipher Tales, where we uncover the hidden stories that changed the course of World War II. Today, we reveal when the Spitfire Mk IX shocked German aces into silence, transforming the balance of air power over Europe through a combination of engineering brilliance, desperate innovation, and perfect timing. This wasn't just about Britain building a better fighter. It was about how a rushed development program created an aircraft that matched or exceeded German performance at exactly the moment when German technological superiority threatened to make Allied air operations impossible. The story of the Spitfire Mk IX demonstrates how rapid adaptation and clever engineering can overcome enemy advantages, and how sometimes the most important victories come from denying the enemy their expected dominance rather than achieving absolute superiority. The foundation for understanding German aces' shock requires understanding how dramatically the air war had shifted in Germany's favor by early 1942 with the introduction of the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Throughout 1940 and 1941, Spitfires had maintained rough parity or slight advantages over German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, with the outcome of air combat depending more on pilot skill and tactical positioning than on aircraft performance differences. The Spitfire Mk V, introduced in early 1941, had been competitive against the Bf 109F, and had allowed RAF Fighter Command to maintain air superiority over Britain and to conduct offensive operations over occupied Europe. But in September 1941, the Luftwaffe introduced the FW-190, and the balance shifted dramatically. The FW-190 was faster than the Spitfire Mk V at most altitudes, climbed better, rolled faster, and carried heavier armament. RAF pilots found themselves suddenly outclassed, suffering losses at unsustainable rates during missions over France. By early 1942, RAF Fighter Command faced a crisis where continued operations would bleed away fighter strength faster than it could be replaced. The development of the Spitfire Mk IX was not a long-planned upgrade, but rather a desperate improvisation forced by the FW-190 threat. Supermarine and Rolls-Royce, the companies responsible for the Spitfire airframe and engine respectively, had been working on a major redesign that would become the Spitfire Mk VIII with improved aerodynamics and strengthened structure to handle more powerful engines. However, the Mk VIII program would take time, and Fighter Command needed something immediately. The solution was to take existing Spitfire Mk V airframes and fit them with the new Merlin 61 engine that had been developed for the Mk VIII. The Merlin 61 featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that dramatically improved high-altitude performance and gave the engine about 25% more power than the Merlin 45 that powered the Mk V. The combination of the proven Mk V airframe with the much more powerful engine could be accomplished quickly using existing production tooling and getting improved aircraft into service months ahead of when the purpose-designed Mk VIII would be ready. The technical achievements of the Merlin 61 engine, the transformed Spitfire performance, represented cutting-edge piston engine technology of the early 1940s. The two-stage supercharger compressed intake air twice, first in a low-pressure stage and then in a high-pressure stage, allowing the engine to maintain power at altitudes where single-stage engines would lose significant performance. The two-speed gearing allowed the supercharger to operate at different speeds, optimized for low altitude or high altitude, providing excellent performance across the entire operating envelope. The intercooler between supercharger stages cooled compressed air to increase its density and allow more air to be packed into cylinders for combustion. These features combined to give the Merlin 61 unprecedented power output, producing 1,560 horsepower compared to the 1,470 horsepower of earlier Merlin variants, with the difference being even more dramatic at altitude, where earlier engines struggled. The engineering sophistication of the Merlin 61 put it at the absolute forefront of piston engine technology and gave any aircraft equipped with it significant performance advantages. The first operational Spitfire Mk IXs reached RAF squadrons in June 1942, just 9 months after the FW-190 had entered service and at the height of RAF struggles against German air superiority. Initial deliveries were limited, with only a few squadrons receiving the new variant, while most Fighter Command units continued operating Mk Vs. RAF commanders made the deliberate decision to keep the Mk IX's existence secret from Germans as long as possible, briefing pilots to avoid discussing the new variant and to not mention it in radio communications where Germans might intercept. The hope was that German pilots encountering Mk IXs would think they were facing Mk Vs and would engage with the overconfidence that had characterized German tactics against the earlier variant. This deception worked brilliantly during the Mk IX's first weeks of operation, with German pilots repeatedly being shocked when aircraft that looked like easy prey turned out to be deadly opponents. The first major air battle where Spitfire Mk IXs engaged German forces in significant numbers occurred during the Dieppe raid on August 19, 1942, and the results shocked German aces who had become accustomed to dominating RAF fighters. The Dieppe operation was a large-scale amphibious assault on the French coast that required massive air cover, with RAF Fighter Command flying over 2,500 sorties to protect the landing forces. The Luftwaffe committed hundreds of fighters to contest British air operations, including substantial numbers of FW-190s. German pilots expected another turkey shoot, similar to recent encounters with Spitfire Mk Vs. Instead, they found themselves facing Spitfire Mk IXs that could match or exceed FW-190 performance. The Mk IXs achieved kill ratios significantly better than Mk Vs had managed in previous operations, shooting down German fighters while suffering fewer losses.
German pilots who survived the battle filed reports describing Spitfires with unexpected performance, noting that some British fighters could climb with or faster than German aircraft and could maintain speed in pursuit or evasion. The psychological impact on German pilots of losing their expected performance advantages was profound and went beyond simple tactical surprise. German air superiority from late 1941 through mid-1942 had created confidence bordering on arrogance among Luftwaffe fighter pilots. They approached combat expecting to win, trusting that their aircraft's superior performance would allow them to dictate engagement terms. The appearance of the Mk IX shattered this confidence. German aces who had been racking up kills against Mk Vs suddenly found themselves in fair or disadvantageous fights. Young German pilots who had been told they flew superior aircraft experienced combat where British fighters were as fast, climbed as well, and maneuvered as effectively as their FW-190s. The loss of certainty about technological superiority created caution and hesitation where there had been aggression, degrading German effectiveness even beyond the direct impact of the Mk IX's performance. The technical comparison between Spitfire Mk IX and Focke-Wulf FW-190 revealed that the two aircraft were closely matched in most performance categories, creating combat situations where pilot skill and tactics became decisive rather than aircraft capabilities. The Mk IX was slightly faster than the FW-190 at most altitudes, with top speed around 408 miles per hour compared to the FW-190's 402 miles per hour. Both aircraft climbed well, with the Mk IX having slight advantages at high altitudes, while the FW-190 was marginally better at medium altitudes. The Mk IX turned tighter than the FW-190, maintaining the traditional Spitfire advantage in dogfighting maneuverability. The FW-190 rolled faster and had better acceleration in dives due to its heavier weight and more powerful engine. The FW-190 carried heavier armament, with 4 20mm cannon plus machine guns, compared to the Mk IX's typical armament of 2 20mm cannon and 4 machine guns. The close match between the two aircraft meant that combat outcomes depended on pilot ability to exploit their aircraft's advantages while negating enemy advantages, creating more uncertain and dangerous combat than the one-sided encounters German pilots had enjoyed against Mk Vs. The production evolution of the Spitfire Mk IX showed British commitment to exploiting the successful design and using it to re-establish air superiority. Initial plans had been to produce Mk IXs only as a stopgap measure until the purpose-designed Mk VIII became available. But the Mk IX proved so successful and so easy to produce that it became the primary production variant. Over 5,600 Spitfire Mk IXs were eventually built, far more than any other Spitfire variant, and more than enough to equip most RAF fighter squadrons, plus many Allied squadrons operating British aircraft. The massive production run meant that German forces increasingly faced Mk IXs rather than Mk Vs, eroding German tactical advantages across the entire front and making air operations progressively more costly for the Luftwaffe. The industrial capacity to produce thousands of high-performance fighters demonstrated British manufacturing strength and allowed Britain to sustain operations even while accepting losses that would have been crippling if replacement aircraft weren't available.
The tactical evolution of RAF operations once Mk IXs became available showed how air forces adapt when they gain capability advantages. During the period of FW-190 dominance, RAF Fighter Command had been forced to use primarily defensive tactics, flying sweeps designed to minimize losses rather than to aggressively engage German fighters. With the Mk IX, RAF operations became more offensive again. Fighter Command could escort bombers more effectively, knowing their fighters could protect bombers rather than being driven off by superior German fighters. Fighter-bomber operations could be conducted with reduced risk because escorts could actually defend against German interception.
Long-range penetration missions became feasible again as fighter pilots gained confidence that they could survive encounters with German fighters rather than being massacred. The return to offensive operations forced Germans to shift resources to defensive operations and reduce their ability to conduct offensive fighter sweeps over Britain or against Allied shipping. The German response to the Spitfire Mk IX included both short-term tactical adaptations and longer-term efforts to regain performance advantages through new aircraft development. Tactical guidance to Luftwaffe fighter units emphasized exploiting FW-190 advantages in rolling and diving while avoiding prolonged turning fights where Spitfires maintained traditional advantages. German pilots were instructed to use boom and zoom tactics, diving on British fighters from altitude, attacking quickly, and diving away rather than staying to dogfight. Formation tactics were revised to maintain altitude advantage and to avoid situations where German fighters might be caught in disadvantageous positions. These tactical adaptations helped reduce German losses but couldn't restore the dominance that FW-190s had enjoyed against Mark Vs. The long-term response involved accelerating development of improved German fighters, including the FW-190D and T-152 with improved high-altitude performance, but these aircraft wouldn't reach service in significant numbers until late in the war. The expansion of Spitfire Mk IX operations beyond fighter command to other theaters and other air forces demonstrated the aircraft's effectiveness and British willingness to share advanced technology with allies. USAF fighter groups operating from Britain received Mk IXs to supplement their American aircraft, giving American pilots experience with one of the war's best fighters. Free French, Polish, Czech, and other Allied squadrons received Mk IXs, allowing them to operate with confidence against German opposition. Mk IXs were deployed to the Mediterranean theater, where they provided performance advantages against German fighters operating in North Africa and Italy. Mk IXs served in the Far East against Japanese opposition, though they were less common there due to distance from production centers and because other aircraft were often more suitable for Pacific operations. The wide deployment of the Mk IX created a global impression among both Allies and Axis forces that Britain had regained air superiority through superior fighter design. The specific accounts from German aces who faced Spitfire Mk IXs provide personal testimony to the shock and frustration of losing expected advantages. One German ace with over 50 victories described his first encounter with a Mk IX in a post-war interview, recalling his confusion when the Spitfire he was attacking simply accelerated away despite being in what should have been a vulnerable position. He stated that he initially thought his engine was malfunctioning before realizing that the Spitfire was simply faster than his FW-190. Another German pilot wrote in his diary about a combat over France where he engaged 3 Spitfires that he expected would be easy victories, only to find himself fighting for his life against aircraft that matched his performance in every category. He barely survived, managing to escape only because other German fighters drew British attention away from him. A third ace, famous among German fighter pilots for his tactical skill, described the Mk IX as the British fighter that ended German air superiority, stating that the psychological blow of no longer having the best fighter was as significant as the tactical reality of facing capable opponents. The propaganda and intelligence dimensions of the Spitfire Mk IX's introduction reveal how both sides used information about aircraft capabilities to affect morale and to deceive enemies. British authorities deliberately downplayed the Mk IX's superiority in public statements, emphasizing that it was simply an improved version of existing Spitfire designs rather than a revolutionary new aircraft. This modesty served multiple purposes. It prevented German intelligence from understanding the extent of British performance improvements. It managed expectations among British public and military who had become demoralized by FW-190 dominance. And it created surprise when German pilots encountered aircraft that exceeded the publicized capabilities. Conversely, German propaganda initially denied that British fighters had achieved parity or superiority, claiming that German aircraft remained technologically superior and that any German losses were due to numerical disadvantages rather than performance deficits. This propaganda line became increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence mounted that British fighters were at least equals of German aircraft. The maintainability and reliability advantages of the Spitfire Mk IX, the loud high operational readiness rates, contributed to its success beyond pure performance characteristics. The Merlin 61 engine, while more complex than earlier Merlin variants, benefited from years of development experience and was reasonably reliable when properly maintained. The Spitfire airframe was well understood by ground crews after years of service, meaning that maintenance could be performed efficiently. The availability of spare parts through established supply networks meant that damaged or worn components could be replaced quickly. The result was that RAF squadrons equipped with Mk IXs maintained high percentages of serviceable aircraft, allowing them to generate mission sortie rates that German units often couldn't match due to their maintenance challenges. The operational readiness advantage meant that numerically equivalent forces actually resulted in British advantages in available fighters. The night operations capabilities that were explored with some Spitfire Mk IX variants expanded the aircraft's utility beyond daylight air superiority missions. Limited numbers of Mk IXs were equipped with radar and adapted for night fighting, allowing them to engage German night intruders or to escort RAF bombers at night. While the Mk IX was never as successful as specialized night fighters like the Mosquito, its capability to operate effectively at night when required added flexibility to RAF operations and demonstrated the basic design's versatility. The night-capable Mk IXs also served as testbeds for radar and avionics that would be incorporated into later fighter designs. The influence of combat experience with Spitfire Mk IXs on subsequent British fighter design showed how operational feedback drove continuous improvement. Lessons learned about what worked well and what could be improved fed into development of later Spitfire variants, including the Mark 14 with even more powerful engines and the Griffin-powered variants that served into the post-war period. The Mk IX's success validated the approach of rapid incremental improvements over waiting for major redesigns, influencing British aircraft development philosophy for the remainder of the war. The operational data from Mk IX combat also informed British understanding of what performance characteristics mattered most in fighter combat, shaping requirements for next-generation fighters that would enter service after the war. The post-war preservation and commemoration of Spitfire Mk IXs has ensured that the aircraft's significance is remembered and that surviving examples can be studied by aviation historians and enthusiasts. Many Mk IXs survived the war, and several remain in flying condition today, maintained by museums and private collectors. The flying examples appear regularly at air shows where audiences can see and hear the aircraft that returned air superiority to the RAF. Museums, including the Imperial War Museum and the RAF Museum, maintain extensive collections of Spitfire variants, including Mk IXs, with detailed documentation about their operational history. The preserved aircraft serve as tangible connections to the period when the Mk IX shocked German aces and changed the air war's trajectory. The pilot perspectives from RAF aviators who flew Spitfire Mk IXs revealed their appreciation for an aircraft that restored their confidence and gave them tools to fight on equal or better terms with German opposition. Pilots who had flown Mark Vs and then transitioned to Mk IXs consistently described the dramatic improvement in performance and capability. They spoke of no longer feeling outclassed when engaging German fighters, of being able to pursue fleeing Germans rather than being pursued, and of having aircraft that matched or exceeded anything the Luftwaffe could field. The pilot confidence that came from flying competitive or superior aircraft translated into more aggressive tactics and higher morale, creating psychological advantages that compounded the technical advantages of the Mk IX's performance. The strategic consequences of Britain regaining air superiority through the Spitfire Mk IX extended beyond immediate tactical outcomes to affect the entire course of the war in Europe. German inability to maintain air superiority meant that Allied preparations for the eventual invasion of France could proceed without being disrupted by German air attacks. The Luftwaffe had to shift from offensive operations to defensive efforts to protect German territory from Allied bombing, dispersing fighter resources and reducing their ability to concentrate forces. The morale impact on German forces of seeing their air force lose superiority contributed to broader German demoralization as it became clear that Germany was losing the technological and industrial competition. The Mark IX didn't win the war alone, but it played a critical role in preventing German air superiority that would have made Allied victory far more difficult and costly. This is the story of when the Spitfire Mark IX shocked German aces into silence, ending a period of German air dominance and restoring balance to air combat over Europe. The German ace who confidently closed on what he thought was easy prey, only to find himself fighting for survival against an aircraft that matched or exceeded his performance. The Luftwaffe pilots who filed confused reports about Spitfires with impossible capabilities, not understanding that they were facing a new variant that had leapfrogged German technology. The British engineers who improvised a solution by marrying a proven airframe to a revolutionary engine, creating one of the war's most successful fighters through desperate innovation rather than careful planning. The RAF pilots who went from expecting losses to expecting victories, knowing they finally flew aircraft that could meet German fighters on equal or better terms. The Mark IX proved that technological advantage in warfare is temporary and that the side that adapts fastest usually wins, even when they're starting from behind. But here's the secret that will blow your mind. The Spitfire Mark IX almost never existed. A single engineer made an unauthorized decision to test the Merlin 61 in a Mark V airframe, violating direct orders. If he had been caught before proving it worked, he would have been fired, and Britain might have lost the air war. His name was deliberately kept secret for decades. Want to know who he was and why his superiors tried to stop him? And there's an even more shocking twist. One German ace actually stole a Spitfire Mark IX and flew it back to Germany for testing. What German engineers discovered when they examined it changed everything about how Germany designed fighters. But the real question is, how did one man steal a Spitfire Mark IX from a heavily guarded RAF base in the middle of England? Curious about the unauthorized test that saved the RAF? Want to know how a German pilot stole a Spitfire? Subscribe to Cipher Tales because our next video reveals the Spitfire variant that was better than the Mark IX, but that Britain refused to produce in numbers. The reason why involves a decision so controversial that it's still debated by historians today. Hit that like button if you love stories about engineering genius changing the course of history. Drop a comment. What are the World War II aircraft or battles should we investigate? The fighter that was too fast for its own guns? The bomber that flew higher than fighters could reach? The aircraft that changed everything but everyone forgot? Share this with anyone who loves aviation history, World War II, or the technological arms races that determined victory and defeat. Because sometimes the most important victories come from restoring balance when your enemy thinks they've won. Until next time, remember, technological superiority is temporary, and the side that adapts fastest usually wins, even when they're starting from behind. This is Cipher Tales, where every aircraft has a secret, where engineering brilliance changes everything, and where the stories of how we won are more incredible than you ever imagined.